In the previous lecture, we got familiar with different ways of creating a snack bar, and we also learned how to set the duration of a snack bar. In this lecture, we are going to add a floating action button to our project, and for its event handler, we are going to use a snack bar instead of a toast. First, I remove all the codes that I have written in the previous lecture inside my main activity. I go to the resource section, and under layout, I open the activity main layout. As you can see, my root element is a constraint layout, which I am going to remove completely. Now I use a relative layout, and I close my root element. In the preview pane, I set the width and height of my relative layout to match parent. Now inside my relative layout, I'm going to define a floating action button. I open a new tag and type android.support.design.widget.floating-action-button. My floating action button requires a width and a height. I set these attributes to wrap content in the preview pane. As you can see, a new floating action button has been placed under the toolbar. After width and height, I define an ID for it. @+ID / I name my ID, for example, fab_ID. I want my floating action button to be displayed at the bottom right side of the screen. So I type Android:\layout_align parent button. I set the value of this attribute to true. You see that my floating action button was placed at the bottom of my screen. Also, I type Android:\layout_align parent right. I set the value of this attribute to true as well. And Android:\layout_align parent end. I set its value to true. As we expected, our floating action button has been placed at the bottom right corner of the screen. Now I'm going to give a margin of 16 dp to my floating action button using the layout margin attribute. I select an icon for my floating action button. To select an icon, I head over to materialdesignicons.com. I search for mail, and for example, I select this icon. Advanced export, size 24, and color white. I download the icon, and I open the folder where I have saved it. I copy the icon. I return to Android Studio, and I paste the icon inside the drawable folder. Now I'm going to add the new icon to my floating action button. I want to use Android source attribute. I type Android:src equals @drawable / email. As you see, the icon was placed inside my floating action button. And finally, I set the size of my floating action button to normal. So I type app: I import app to my layout by pressing Alt and Return. Then I type fab size equals, and from the list I select normal. So far, we have created a floating action button. I'm done with the activity main layout. I close it and I return to main activity. Inside the main activity, I create an object from the floating action button class. I name my object fab and semicolon. Now inside the onCreate method, I get the reference for my fab object. Fab equals, I cast the right side to floating action button, find view by ID, inside the parentheses I type r.id.fab_id. Once I connected my fab object to its view, I'm going to define an onClick listener for it. New onClick listener. As you see, an onClick method has been added to our onClick listener. Each time we click the floating action button, the code inside the onClick method will be executed. Now I want to display a snack bar each time I click the floating action button. So inside the main activity class, I define an object from the Snackbar class, and I name it Snackbar. Inside the onClick method, I type snackbar equals snackbar.make. Inside the parentheses, a view argument is required. Inside our onClick method, we have a parameter named view. We can pass this parameter as argument to snackbar.make. So I type view The next argument is a text. I open double quotes, and inside the quotes, I type message sent. The next argument is the duration of my snack bar. For this argument, I type length indefinite. I change its duration using the setDuration method, and I pass it 8000. Finally, I type snackbar.show. Okay, let's check out our app on the emulator. Once the app starts up in the emulator, you see that we have a floating action button at the bottom right of the screen. I click on the floating action button and the snack bar is displayed with the text message sent. After 8 seconds, it disappears. There's a problem I want to point out here. The problem is that when you click on the floating action button, the snack bar is displayed over the floating action button. To solve this problem, we must place the floating action button inside a special layout named CoordinatorLayout. So I stop my emulator and close the main activity class. Now I open the activity main layout. As I said, we must place our floating action button inside a special layout named CoordinatorLayout. So above the floating action button inside the relative layout, I type Android.support.design.widget.coordinatorLayout. Our coordinator layout requires a width and a height. In the preview pane, I set the width and height of the coordinator layout to match parent. Now I close my coordinator layout completely. In short, we defined a coordinator layout and we set its height and width to match parent. Now our floating action button requires to be placed inside the coordinator layout. So I cut this line of code and paste it after the floating action button. We placed our floating action button inside the coordinator layout, but you see that the floating action button is shown under the toolbar. In order to place our floating action button at the bottom right corner of the screen, I removed the align parent attributes from my floating action button and use layout gravity instead. Okay, where am I supposed to show the floating action button? At the bottom right of the screen. So I type button, then I enter a binary or operator. Next I type end, which means at the bottom right side of the screen. Also be careful about capital and small letters. Let's run the project once again on the emulator. Alright, our application is running on the emulator. I click on my floating action button And yes, as you see, the problem with Snackbar being displayed over the floating action button is now solved, and the Snackbar didn't go over the floating action button anymore. And that's because we used a coordinator layout. So remember, each time you wanted to use a floating action button in your project and use a Snackbar message aligned with it, then be sure to put your floating action button inside a coordinator layout. And that's it for this lecture. In the next lecture, we will add an action to our snack bar and further explore snack bars.